Hello and welcome to the Hoop Collective podcast. We talk about the NBA, which we're doing on Sunday afternoon. I guess it's morning. It's late Sunday morning. Joining me from New York City, where he's headed to Philadelphia for the 76ers Media Day on Monday. And then you got a big week, Tim Bontemps. What do you got going on?
A bunch of travel for training camp. Got a wedding next weekend in California.
Oh, I mean, that wedding is nice and fine. I'm talking about where are you going for training camp?
The Sixers and Heat are having training camp in Atlantis in the Bahamas, and I wish it was in Fort Collins again this year because it would be a lot simpler for me, but it's not.
Well, have you ever heard somebody so melancholy about going to the Bahamas? Just be careful.
Fresh off a red eye, and it's pouring rain here in New York, so it's a dreary day.
Just be careful on the boats. That's all I'm going to say. Joining us from Los Angeles, California, where he went to a Big Ten Classic. When I think of Big Ten football, Bobby Marks, I think of USC, Wisconsin, and that's where you were yesterday, watching the Trojans get their first Big Ten win, right?
It was their first Big Ten win after the loss to Michigan the week before. And when I came out for Parents Weekend, the last thing I thought we would be doing is a blockbuster Karl-Anthony Towns trade. So that certainly has taken up most of the weekend here.
Well, that is why we are here. That is why you two gentlemen are here, because you guys led the reporting on the big trade that came down late Friday night. This might be the biggest trade for the next year, because I just think it's so hard to make trades for the top teams because of their payrolls and the new apron rules. And then when you think about two teams at the top of the contenders in each conference, both flirting with the aprons, trading all-star players for one another, it kind of undercuts our argument, Bobby, that the new rules are going to make big trades harder when then there's a giant trade like this right on the eve of training camp. But I do think this is a very unique trade. You've written and talked a lot about it already. And it's no surprise that the Knicks wanted Karl Towns. I think the surprise is that it actually got done, and the machinations of what went through it, which you've talked a lot about. But I know that you were tracking this for a while. Are you surprised this got done?
Yeah, just because, and Tim and I talked about it on Thursday. I thought on Thursday, on a scale of 1 to 5, we were probably at a 2, somewhere around there. I didn't think I thought there was it would have taken a lot for this to come together. Just as you said, when you're dealing with one team that's over the second apron in Minnesota and one team that's flirting with who's hard capped at the second apron in New York, and you're moving a $49 million player in Towns, that's hard to do. I'm stunned that when the new CBA got introduced, that the NBA just didn't say like apron teams can only trade with each other because we wouldn't have had this deal, because enter the fourth team, with the third team is as Tim reported, is Charlotte here. But I am surprised that it came about this quickly here. They were able to get the framework and then finalize as far as the trade. The trade is not finalized through the NBA, but it is as far as with who's going where with New York and Minnesota here. But yeah, I'm surprised it came pretty quick in that 24 hours since Thursday night.
Bontemps, we'll talk about the structure of it a little bit later. Karl Towns he was an all-star last season. He's been an all-NBA player several times in his career. The Knicks are acquiring a guy who is in his prime, floor-stretching big man. They didn't have a starting center to start the season. They get one of the elite centers in the NBA. So how come this doesn't feel like a grand slam for the Knicks?
Well, this is one of the more fascinating deals in recent memory, because I think for every person you talk to, they have a different opinion on how it went. Some people think Minnesota won the trade in a big way. Some people think the Knicks won the big trade in a big way. I've had a decent number of people hit me and think both teams got worse. It's just I don't remember a deal that is this divisive in opinion across the board. And the fact that it came a year to the day from the Damian Lillard, Drew Holiday trade last summer or last fall going into training camp is fitting, because in that deal you had two star guards getting traded for each other in a deal that had ripple effects for a long time up to and including Boston eventually winning the title with Drew Holiday. And this deal, I think, could have similar ripple effects. And the thing I keep coming back to your original question on the Knicks, is you go back to the end of the season, and the Knicks had spent years being extraordinarily patient and stockpiling assets and building up a war chest and signing guys to smart contracts and methodically building this treasure trove of assets to go, in theory, get a superstar player. They have traded all of those assets, and they have no superstar players in return. You could say Jalen Brunson has become a superstar player, but Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Karl-Anthony Towns, all very good players, but none of them are a superstar. And the Knicks have traded a ton of draft picks, a ton of good players. In this trade, they trade Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo and a pretty sneaky good pick in this Detroit Pistons future first round pick. Like, people say a protected first from Detroit and they think, it's probably never going to convey. The way that protection goes down over time, it's one of the better picks to trade in the league. Like, that was
also Minnesota didn't have anything else they could trade. Now they get an asset that they can use. They might get a pick in next year's draft with it. But
there's a whole other part. Yeah. The Minnesota part's a whole other part of the deal. But from the Knicks standpoint, it's a truly gigantic bet on Karl Towns, which is fascinating on a lot of fronts. You have him reunited with the coach he had in Minnesota, Tom Thibodeau, which went a couple of years and didn't go great. Tibbs ends up getting fired in the middle of his third year. On a team that didn't have a center, they have traded all their chips in to get Karl-Anthony Towns as a center. And I'll remind everyone that 2 years ago, Minnesota decided they had to trade for a center because they didn't think Karl Towns could be the anchor of a championship caliber defense. So they trade for Rudy Gobert to play these two guys together. Now you have him coming to the Knicks, and he's, in theory, this is a team that believes it can be a championship contending team. He's got to be the anchor of this defense at the center spot. So it's a huge bet on Karl Towns. It's a huge bet in the way the summer went on OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges. They gave OG Anunoby $200 million after trading for him, and they trade everything he had nailed down to the Nets to get him to come across town in that deal. And for all that stuff, to trade all that stuff, and, as we've talked about many times, Bobby has made huge deals like this in the past. When you trade all that kind of stuff, to me, you want to sit there after the deal and say, this team is a guaranteed bona fide championship contender. And I think if you look at the Knicks today, where they sit in the East, I can't convince myself they're better than Philly. I definitely don't think they're better than Boston. And so they've traded all this stuff. They've locked themselves into this team. And, I'm not sure I can guarantee they're a favorite to make the conference finals. It's just a strange spot to be in when you look at where they were 6 months ago with all the stuff they had and where they are now with the team they've got, albeit a very talented top 5 or 6 guys.
So I will just say, I'll go back to the day after the draft, 2000. What year was Towns drafted, Bobby? 15, I think.
15.
Yeah, 15.
15. Yeah. The day after the draft, I'm in Minneapolis. Actually, they were introducing Tyus Jones and Karl Towns. And I remember sitting there before the press conference, chatting with their two agents who were there, Rob Pelinka and Leon Rose. So that was interesting when you look back on that day, especially. But I remember chatting with Leon, and he was talking and raving about Karl. I mean, not that that was surprising. I mean, the guy was the number 1 pick on the draft, and just talking about what a great person he was, talking about his family, talking about New Jersey roots and all. And Leon had done the whole Leon Wes Wesley connection to Kentucky. For years there was that pipeline that Wes Wesley would help recruit players for John Calipari at Kentucky, and they would graduate on. And not all of them went to Leon Rose, but many of them did. And this was a particularly close one to Leon. He's not as close to the family as Jalen Brunson, but the same type of connection where Leon knew him into his teen years, and there were things happening in with the Karl-Anthony's teen years that were lining him up to this, including playing for John Calipari for the Dominican Republic when he was like 15 or 16 years old.
I remember watching him play. I believe they played Team USA in 2014 in the exhibition games at MSG, and Karl played on the Dominican team for Calipari going into that freshman year at Kentucky.
Right, and that led to the Calipari, that led to him going to Kentucky. Well, Leon was there for all of that. And so he wasn't holding him in diapers like with Jalen, but this is a player that Leon goes way back with, has a deep connection to, was with him through his formative years in Minnesota when he became a max player, when he became an all-star for the first time. So what Leon is doing here is he's essentially following the instincts that led him to want Jalen Brunson so badly and doing what it was to get Jalen Brunson. Now, the cost for Jalen Brunson was a lot less. There's a lot less skin in the game. But at the time, as we've talked about, him outlaying $100 million and later getting busted for tampering, although I think it's one of the most laughable tampering things in the history of the NBA. But whatever. He made getting Jalen Brunson the number one priority. They made a series of moves, not as dramatic as this. And so basically what Leon Rose is saying is, trust me, I knew what we could get out of Jalen Brunson. I knew how to unlock him. I knew how to reach him. And basically it's the same guiding philosophy here with Karl Towns. And the interesting thing, Bobby, is kind of like way back when the Clippers made the deal for Paul George. The assets that they gave up for Paul George weren't really just for Paul George. It was for Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. So you have to look at that trade in that way. The Mikal Bridges trade and how many first-round picks was it?
5.
5 first-round picks.
5 plus a swap plus a net second that's going to be a top 35 pick.
That trade wasn't just for Mikal Bridges. That trade was for Mikal Bridges getting Jalen Brunson to take this discount, $112 million or whatever, less than he could have signed for if he had waited. And probably Mikal Bridges taking a discount. I don't know what will happen there. He becomes extension eligible, I think, pretty soon, Bobby.
He does. And I think the window is going to open within the next couple of days for 2 for $60. And the indication I've gotten just from talking with people is that there is not going to be an extension.
Oh, not going to be an extension.
That he will wait until next year to look at what because he's limited as far as the 6-month rule, as far as what he can extend for. Next year, he can extend for 4 years. So it just gives him more flexibility as far as that could certainly change by October 21st. And maybe this trade does change that thinking here. This was talking to people before this trade happened. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, he's that window opens relatively soon.
Okay. But one of the reasons why they're able to quote unquote afford Karl Towns is because of the dynamics, the Jalen Brunson contract, which was greased by the Mikal Bridges trade. So the Knicks have a series of things sort of falling together here, which includes getting Jalen Brunson what he wanted, which was Mikal Bridges, getting Leon Rose what he wanted, which was Karl Towns. And I know that Tibbs wanted more star power. He appreciated what he had on the roster. We've talked on this pod before about the Knicks done a really good job of aligning their talent to fit with the way their coach wants to coach. Tibbs did want more star power. So Towns doesn't really fit the way Tibbs wants to coach, but he does fit what they want from a star standpoint. And there was a lot of uncertainty into what Mitchell Robinson was going to be able to give them this year.
Well, I mean, there wasn't that much uncertainty. They said I reported on Monday that he's going to be out till at least December, probably longer, with this ongoing foot issue from the summer. And Tom Thibodeau has forever played with a big on the court virtually at all times. It was certain. That's why we talked the other day about how it was interesting. He brought up openly that Julius Randle might play center, and the Knicks basically had Jericho Sims, who's not really proven to be a backup center yet in the league, young, raw, very big, gifted, physically center, and then Precious Achiuwa, who's listed at 6'8" forward, that it's probably a little charitable at that height, that played well for them last year, but that was their center rotation. That didn't seem to jive with, to your point about how the Knicks have had guys to fit with the way the coach wants to play. It felt like something was going to move one way or the other. It's just fairly remarkable. This was the move right now.
Yeah. So basically, Leon is saying, trust me. He won't say that publicly, Bobby, because he doesn't give interviews, but actions over words. The actions over words are, trust me when I thought Brunson was a $100 million player. Trust me when I think that this guy who's starting a 4-year, $220 million deal is going to work. And I will say this, the Knicks starting 5, those 5 guys, It's pretty good. Now, Bontemps, you say you still have Philly ahead of them? Yeah, I mean, I got to see how Philly plays. I'm not going to engage with you on that, but
Well, it's just a couple things. One, Joel Embiid versus Karl Towns. If Joel Embiid is healthy, that's a pretty heavy advantage in favor of Philly. On top of that,
Towns fouls like crazy.
Well, yes. And on top of that, Philly, remarkably for a team that went into the summer with no players on its roster other than Joel, literally, I think has fairly significantly more depth than the Knicks. And that, the Knicks basically have that starting five, which is awesome. And then Deuce McBride, who is very good. And then they got a ton of question marks, and they don't really have any way to address that now. So that's the other thing that's fairly incredible from where they were back in the spring. We talked about how deep they were. They had all these different ways.
Well, they weren't deep at the end. At the end, they had 4 guys.
Well, yes.
I mean, I know.
Pre-injury. And then after they added Bridges, they had all this depth and wings. They could do all this different stuff. And now you look at their team. And I mean, when Bobby put the stuff in our sheet and I was sitting there looking at it, and we talked about it Friday night after the trade, I was like, man, there is not a lot here outside the top 5 or 6 guys.
That's the biggest thing that's glaring to me. And like when we did the trade, when the trade happened Friday, and then you're writing about it and you're thinking, they didn't have to include Deuce McBride, you still have Josh Hart. But then when you put the depth chart on paper, it's like, okay, with Robinson out, you're going to have Josh Hart starting, right? Towns at the 5, OG at the 4, Bridges, Hart, Brunson. And then you look at their depth, and it's Deuce McBride. You've got Tyler Kolek, Cameron Payne. We'll see what happens in the front court. Robinson's out. You still have Achua. It's like it's a mixed bag and you're so restrictive. When this trade gets finalized, they're going to be a couple $100,000, maybe even $100,000 below the second apron. So what happens with the Bridges trade, and now this, you just start running out of tools in your toolbox, right? Like you start backing yourself into a corner here, and there's going to be more assets going out in the Charlotte part. You're going to be limited there. So to be able to restock your roster with your depth, that's probably the biggest concern for me. Not the starting 5. It's just that the lack of durability from Anunoby. He's never been. He doesn't play 65 games. And then where's your front court? The likelihood is that you could probably re-sign Marcus Morris, who you had to waive because of roster rules with this when this trade is going to be. But your front court and you're losing DiVincenzo, I think, is one of probably the under radar things that hasn't been as talked about as much. And I know he had to be part of the trade here, but I think that's a big part. So the depth for New York is that's the concerning part.
Well, and the other thing too on the depth part, just because we think OG is the first person you think of with his injury history, right? Here's Karl Towns' games played the last 5 years: 35, 50, 74, 29, 62. Like Karl, first 3 or 4 years of his career, I don't think he missed a single game. He was always available. But past few years, he's had a series of different calf and leg injuries, and they need him. Like, he cannot miss time. He's got to be out there because for all the reasons they traded for him. So there are some real potential injury risks. And obviously there are with Philly. If people are going to start, I'm sure Knicks fans are screaming at the pod saying, how could you put these guys behind Philly? It's obviously there's plenty of concerns all around here, but the Knicks are top heavy and they've got some significant injury questions. It's one of many reasons why this is a truly fascinating trade. And I agree on the DiVincenzo part in particular, why I liked it for Minnesota, but we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a bit.
We'll get to Minnesota in a second. I think the Knicks are counting on a couple of things. One, they're counting on the Iron Man that is Mikal Bridges. The guy never misses games, plays minutes. You hope that continues. Secondly, he's going to shoot a lot of threes. Donte DiVincenzo, I believe, set the team record for 3-pointers last season. It was a huge part. I think he averaged like 10 or 11 attempts a game.
Yeah, he made 283, I believe, in this season, and I'm pretty sure it's one of the top. I'm going to look right now. I think it's one of the top 20 single 3-point season in the history of the league. So, yeah, it's 14th all time. So it definitely set the team record.
So they're going to want Bridges to shoot a ton of threes. They're going to hope Bridges plays a lot of minutes and a lot of games because, you just know Anunoby's not going to do that. Anunoby's going to miss time. And also you're going to rely on Deuce McBride, who I nicknamed Trace McBride because he had some stretches last year where he was just red hot from 3-point range. They're really super leaning into him, and they've got him at a really good contract number. And he's going to be a big part of what they do. A year ago, he was having trouble even getting in the rotation, sitting there behind Quentin Grimes. And so now I think he's going to be a core player. So those are the things that they're betting on. And they're betting on Karl Towns to be a dynamic player at the offensive end. And, playing with Jalen Brunson, I mean, what do you want Jalen Brunson to have? You want him to have space to operate. Well, you are going to have space here. Karl Towns is a space machine. And, if you think about the way that this team can spread the floor and the way that Brunson can attack going downhill and the options that he'll have, I can certainly understand the possible upside here.
That's the irony. It's a Tom Thibodeau coach team is going to need to be, in my opinion, to be the team they hope to be. They got to be the best offense in the NBA. That's the bet, which is an amazing bet when you think about who their coach is, because that is not the thing people think of with Tom.
Well,
despite
they've
the fact
got
he's had a lot of really good
spectacular
offenses.
Defensive wing players that they can build.
Are you betting that a team with Karl Towns at center is going to be a top 5 defensive team?
No, but I
would say the theory of the team is that they have the best offense in the league, and if they can be at the back of the top 10 defensively with Karl out there, that's a team that could be good enough. They're not going
to be above the top. If they're a bottom 10 defensive team, that's going to be a disaster.
No, you didn't hear what I said. I said to be the team they hope to be, I think they need to be the best offensive team in the league and be in the back end of the top 10 in defense.
Oh, the back end of the top 10.
Like if they could be 10th in defense and first in offense. That's a team that
I don't think they're going to be first
team.
in offense, but forget about that. What they need is when they get to the playoffs to have OG healthy, and you have OG and Bridges as your, if you're thinking about beating the Celtics, you're thinking about how do we deal with Brown and Tatum, and how do we deal with Porzingis, and that is what they've built here. They built a team that is aimed at the Celtics. Now, you can debate about whether that wins 4 out of 7. But if you're going to beat the Celtics, you're going to have to score, because they're going to put up points. And so, we talked about this. Their bet is that the Celtics, their runway is longer than the Celtics. The Celtics are a better team right now, but they're betting on their runway. And Bobby, with the cap going up with the new TV money, they can afford to keep this team. And this team's all under contract. Assuming Bridges eventually gets worked out, they're going to have all these guys under control, and they can add to it. So this is not, certainly they're going to have big expectations for this year, but this is not win in 25 or else. This does, with Karl Towns, his age and his contract status, it does fit into at least that concept of let's build a team that could, over the long run, walk down the Celtics.
Yeah, especially that he's the only player on the roster that's on a max contract. He's on a super max contract here. And then you were going to have to deal with probably the situation with Julius Randle, who has a player option for next year. And so you can make the argument, was the cost of Towns would equal what future cost of DiVincenzo and Randle could be for next year, for example. Could it be 35 and 12, those two players?
And maybe they can find a player that's comparable to DiVincenzo that they can end up getting on the roster. Not tomorrow, but even though he's the Villanova guy and there's that connection, maybe they can replace that player.
Yeah, I guess when you look at the roster, what trade chips do you have left? I think Achua, we'll keep an eye on him when his trade restriction gets lifted in December, on December 15th, really, but it's at a low $6 million salary. As long as Robinson's out, it's hard to say how much trade value does a guy who has 2 years left on his contract, who's continually hurt. They'll have a bunch of second-round picks to play with. I think they've got 10, which will probably go down a little bit after the Charlotte part is finalized. So there are things there, but you're right. It's not, Minnesota, and we'll talk about Minnesota, when you have 3 guys on max contracts, it's hard to kind of, keep a roster together.
Yeah. So it's certainly interesting. We'll see what the Knicks say on Monday. it's I don't think
I
Carl was.
suspect they're not going to say much because I don't think this is going to be done for a minute for a variety of reasons.
Well, they can hide behind that if they want, but everybody in the room is going to know what's going on.
Sure.
Especially when there's probably a few less people there at media day, I would say.
So what is Donte DiVincenzo speaking? What is Julius Randle speaking? Yeah. One of the reasons why this is going to take some time is that the Knicks are going to have to do multiple sign and trades with players who were not in their plans, who were just sort of sitting around. And this is the thing. The Knicks have shown creativity in deals before, and this is what's going to have to happen if you're playing with the the apron restrictions. They were, by the way, Bob, you just mentioned that they were restricted to the second apron because of
the Bridges trade. Yeah. This trade is similar to the Bridges trade where, when it gets reported, it's Bridges for Bogdanovic, but then it's like, there's so many different things, other things that have to happen to basically fit it within, listen, when you're over the apron, first or second apron, you can't take back more money in a trade. And when you do the math out there, you don't have to be a math major, and Towns makes 49 and the other two make a combined, 40, for example.
Yeah.
Like, you gotta get there somehow.
Well,
and then
the other thing too.
And then the other thing is, and that's why we've talked when we started the pod, like the third team here. So when it's like a giant Rubik's Cube, right? So then, but Minnesota can't take back more money. So you basically are, okay, who's the third team here to take back that, like, not $8.8 million in additional contracts here? But it's fortunately for New York, it's like you still have, the rules are that you can include guys in sign and trade that finish the season on your roster. And they had a bunch of guys, whether it be Charlie Brown or Dwayne Washington or Daquan Jeffries, that, two-way guys or rest of the season guys that you can do sign and trades. If those guys weren't there, man, now you're looking at, okay, who on our roster do we have to trade? Right now, it's like
they would have had to include Mitchell Robinson in the trade to make it work legally. Because that was, like you said, the fascinating thing about this, and the reason why your initial point, Brian, about the CBA, it is going to be hard to make trades for a while. With the new rules, you've got to spend up to a certain amount before the season starts. There's not teams just sitting around with a ton of cap space anymore. And these teams that are up against these aprons, both the Knicks and the Wolves, couldn't take in more money than they sent out in the trade. So by nature, if you got two teams that both can't do that, you got to find somebody to take more money. And there's just only a handful of teams right now that can actually do that. And it's
getting way into the CBA weeds. The one thing that is changed in this is that teams they can absorb players with more than just cap space. They can now use exceptions to
your room.
Yeah. And so, like, if you have a mid-level exception, $12 million, or whatever it is, and you haven't used it, or you've used part of it, you can still, you don't have to be sitting there with cap space.
But again, if we're going to get way into the weeds on it for the same thing we're talking about, if you take in more money in a trade than you send out, you're hard capped at the first apron. So for all these teams that are up against these aprons, which is a lot of the league, even if you wanted to participate and use your level exception, if you're hard capped at the first apron and you're around it or over it, then you can't be involved anyway.
Right, and that's a hard decision to make in September when everybody's 0-0.
Well, yeah, and here's the reason why, like, a deal like this is easier to make in right now is that you can expand your roster to 21 players. Right, once we get going in October 22nd, that's at 15. Once we get to the regular season, signing trades are no longer available. Like, you can't do that anymore here. So, and here's a memo to teams is that when we get, and we're ways away from the month of April, when we get to April, like, and you have extra two-way players, spots open, and you have extra roster spots, sign guys, because then you can use them in situations like this when you need it. Going back to the Bridges trade, New York used Shake Milton, who they signed like the last week of the season, to be able to include it in that deal.
I had an agent joke to me he was going to look at players who were going to be potential signings in March and April and try to get them so that he could maybe cash in on deals later, unlike this, which I thought was a pretty funny line, but also could be a sneaky thing as you go forward.
And the Knicks were working in April to leave these things open.
The Knicks have done a very good job in recent years. As we talked about at the beginning, they've done a great job of stockpiling assets across the board. It's allowed them to make these trades, and it's what has made the output of the trade so fascinating because of where it landed them and what they look like. It's going to be a super fun team to watch.
Something I didn't think I would ever say 4 or 5 years ago, the New York Knicks are a certified smart franchise. It is not something that we've seen much in the last few decades. However, they still got to do it on the court. Okay, now let's shift over to the Minnesota side of this. One of the reasons why this trade ended up happening was basically because Minnesota had an all-star player that they were going to have a hard time affording both this year and going into the future. We talked dating back 10 months about the financial cliff that the Timberwolves were facing. It really irritated some of the Wolves fans because they were going through this magical season where they were flirting with the number 1 seed and they reached the conference finals, and there were annoying media members talking about, well, how are they going to afford to keep this team together? When the season ended last year, when they lost in Game 5 to Dallas, Karl Towns, who's sitting up there with 4 years on his contract, who had said nothing but I want to be a Timberwolf, was having to answer questions about whether he just played his last game as a Wolf. And it's because of this, because we knew this was coming. Maybe we didn't know it was coming now, but we knew that this was possibly coming. And so part of the reason that this was able to happen is that you did have a team just facing this who was willing to trade Karl Towns for, not assured stars in the future. And so you may say, well, Julius Randle's an all-star, but he's got 1 year on his contract. And Bobby, I'm not sure he's going to re-sign there. I'm not sure if, they're going to have DiVincenzo. He's got a really good deal that he got from below the mid-level multiple years. I don't know if Randle extends there. He can't extend for 6 months now.
Yeah.
Unless there's they could be facing renting Julius Randle. And so they were willing to make that type of trade with a star player in Karl Towns, probably an overpaid star player, but still. And you just don't find that every day. And so it had to be sort of this perfect storm between these two teams. Let me just say this. I wrote about this in a story that published on ESPN on Saturday to give you an idea of where the Timberwolves are. I am told, and somebody could probably take me down on this statement because there's a bunch of different accounting rules. But from what I understand, to put it in the way that the European journalists write it when they write about football, it is understood. ESPN understands that the Wolves are facing $100 million financial loss season this year. In the bottom line, that they were going to be in the red 9 figures. Now, like I said, the team accountant could come on here and hold up a bunch of spreadsheets and say, that's not true. I'm not slamming my name on that and saying it's assured. But from what I understand, they're facing a $100 million loss season. This is a team that has operated relatively frugally for decades. If you said the Clippers were facing a $100 million loss season, you'd be like, well, they operate in the red. That's what they do. Steve Ballmer makes $1 billion a year from his Microsoft dividends alone. He will fund it. There are other teams out there that I could see losing that type of money. The Warriors could do that. Maybe even the Knicks, although the Knicks would never lose that kind of money because they have a cash machine in Madison Square Garden and their network. They were facing losing 9 figures. And if it's not 9, let's just say it's close to 9. I actually think it's potentially well over 9, but I'll just stick with 100 million. So this is a big reality that they've got in front of them. And the thing about it is, Bobby, despite that truth, they've kept the hammer down. They're continuing to spend the money. They're still extending guys on their roster. They haven't extended Rudy Gobert yet, so we'll see what happens there. But they're extending Mike Conley. They're making trades at the deadline or at the draft that were adding, money to their payroll. So they're facing this huge loss, and not only this year but into the future. Huge tax bill. What's the tax bill, Bobby? Was going to be about 100 and
over 100. Yeah, over
105 according to Bobby's latest numbers I just looked up. Second only to the Suns in the league.
Yep.
So think about that. So think about even if you operated at break even, which they were, they're a second apron team. So their payroll was going to be amongst the highest in the league in raw payroll. I'm not sure they could operate at break even if there was no luxury tax at all, just based on their economics. And now you say they've got $100 million in luxury tax, which was more before this trade. This trade reduced their payroll and luxury tax by 8 figures. And then into the future, depending on what happens with Julius Randle, potentially tens and tens and tens of millions into the future. And so that's a reality, number one. Even if they had an owner who was young and not in legal battles, who was extremely wealthy, they would have this financial reality. Second, in November, they are having an arbitration hearing between Mark Lowry and Glenn Taylor to see who will win the contract dispute they have about who owns the team. Lowry and Alex Rodriguez and his 2 new partners, Eric Schmidt, who's a former CEO of Google, and Michael Bloomberg, both of them billionaires, they have let it be known that they've got $900 million in escrow. They've got $200 million set aside in working capital, which is a code for saying we can afford to lose a huge ton of money with this team in the future. If you approve us as the owners, we're not going to declare bankruptcy in 9 months. And they believe that they are going to win that arbitration. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. This is not a legal podcast. But we know that the team is in financial distress, and we don't know who's going to be on the hook and who's going to make the decisions for the spending. And so that sets this stage for Tim Connolly, the team president, to kind of figure out. He doesn't know who he's going to work for in a year. And he's so uncertain about who he's going to work for. He has engineered his contract to give himself an out after this season, because this could end up being a mess. And he could want to opt out and become his own self a free agent in 2025. This is a team that could win the West this year. Very strong contender to win the West this year. This is a formula right here, Bobby, that we've almost never seen. And so they have a deal that comes across their desk where they can take Karl Towns, get out of that $220 million that they owe him, which they're not sure whether or not how many opportunities they're really going to have going forward, where they're not going to have to be on the downside of the trade. They're able to get a player in Julius Randle, who's in his prime, highly motivated, potential contract year here, who can fit with what they've got on their roster, which is an extra center. They have 3 guys who can play center, all 3 of which are decorated. Last year, Karl Towns was an all-star. Naz Reid won 6th Man of the Year. Rudy Gobert won Defensive Player of the Year. They have an extra center. They take out one of those and put in a guy who can play power forward and stretch the floor. He fits. His contract number is palatable, and they add Donte DiVincenzo, who adds to their bench, gives them 3-point shooting, and they get a first-round pick. The fact that they could make a Karl Towns trade, number 1, save money, number 2, and number 3, have anybody arguing that they might have won the trade, whether or not that's true. But you can present a case that they won this trade. I think they had to say yes to that, Bobby.
I think they extracted the most value out of Karl-Anthony Towns. I think the thing that's fascinating the most is a team that gets to a Western Conference, and in a Western Conference this year that is probably as deep as ever. And it's, if you one move could bring down like the house of cards, right? Like you could go from a 2 seed to all the way to the back of the pack. But I think this roster is still a top 4 team. I think they have better roster flexibility than they did before, better versatility. I think there was a lot of, and I wrote about this in the training camp guide that's going to come out. I think there was a lot of pressure on Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon, their 2 first-round picks, that they were going to have to basically throw into the fire because you lost Kyle Anderson and you lost Jordan McLaughlin, and your bench was really Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Naz Reid here. And when you get that Detroit pick, and as you said, Randle and DiVincenzo, it gives them better balance. The cost of Randle and Naz Reid moving forward will probably equal what the cost of Karl-Anthony Towns is next year. And that's the big thing too. Naz Reid's got a player option. Like the likelihood is that Rudy Gobert. And so does Rudy Gobert. The likelihood is that Naz Reid could have been the odd man out if this roster stayed together here. The Gobert thing's going to be fascinating just because he's got he's got a player option. He's extension eligible. Will he take back less, decline the option, take back less, and then guarantee him more money in the next couple of years? I think that's something to watch here. But if we're doing winners and losers, and I understand why New York did it here, but I do like the trade better from Minnesota's standpoint, just because of the versatility factor and DiVincenzo coming off the bench. You can start him. Randle, maybe 3-time All NBA. Health, of course, is we'll have to circle there. And you still have Anthony Edwards. You still have McDaniels. You still have Conley. So you still have those core players.
I mean, it's a fascinating fit for a lot of reasons on the Minnesota side. We talked about it a few weeks ago, to your point on Dillingham and Shannon Bobby. I did a thing on the biggest holes after free agency across the league. And for the Knicks, it was a center. They obviously got a center in this deal. For Minnesota, it was this backup guard spot, where this is a team that had championship aspirations and was expecting a rookie guard, one of those two guys, to have to try to fill that spot behind a guy in his late 30s, and Mike Conley, who in theory, even if he could stay healthy through the year, I would assume Minnesota would like to have him on a similar plan to the one that Al Horford was on with the Celtics last year, where he's probably should play in any back-to-backs all season. He probably should have his minutes as limited as possible to have him be able to play as much as he can in the playoffs. Now you've got Donte DiVincenzo, who can handle the ball a little bit, who can guard a little bit, who showed an ability to shoot in a way he hadn't in the past last year. And, they've had Malik Beasley there in the past. They can run some stuff that they ran in the past with Donte with him. He gives them an outside shooter at the guard spot they haven't had, which helps mitigate the loss of Towns a little bit. And then you have the Randle conundrum, where he is a very good player. It is an interesting fit. He is a guy who shoots a lot of threes, but he doesn't make a lot of threes. He's shot 31% 2 of the last 3 years on over 5 attempts a game. He shot 34% on 8 attempts the other year. So Karl, whatever flaws Karl has as a player, he's one of the best big man shooters of all time, and is consistently up around 40% on high volume, and teams have to really pay attention to him. So they're going to have to work on the spacing thing with him and Rudy. They've got to figure some stuff out roster-wise. But look, the reason this trade happened was because the Wolves had only a limited number of potential options to send Karl Towns anywhere. And the fact they were able to get real value in the trade and give themselves optionality going forward, now they can do a variety of different things. Maybe they can get Rudy on a lower deal going forward on an extension on longer years. Maybe you can get Naz Reid extended. Maybe you can get Julius Randle extended. Because to go back to that point, Brian,
Julius Randle.
They could trade Julius Randle again. It's certainly a possibility. The other thing, you mentioned you're not sure he's going to re-sign. There isn't very much money next summer. It's not like if he gets to free agency, there's a ton of places he could potentially go. So if this is a good fit this year, it might make a lot of sense for him to be back there for some sort of time. So it is.
As a quick aside to that, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yep. No, you're fine.
I was talking to an agent who has a player who's a extension candidate. He's a rookie contract extension candidate. One of the guys who's going to be negotiating with this team over the next month, and he's skeptical he's going to be able to get a deal done with his guy. And he is basically saying what he's telling his players is we are in a 2-year recession in terms of cap space. That it was going to take. It's going to be post 2025 when the new TV deal comes in and the cap goes up and everybody's more teams with cap space. We remember the 2016 year where we had the cap spike. There's actually there's a dearth of cap space. And because of that, teams that have players into extension eligible are doing exactly what you just said, Bontemps. They are lowballing their guys because they know that they don't have a lot of great options. And so some of the agents are basically referring to what's coming as a recession. Not because NBA business is suffering. NBA business is doing great. They're about to get a huge new TV spike, but because of the way the books are, there's not a lot of space. There's going to have to be there's a bit of a backlog. Contracts are going to come onto books. The cap is going to go up, but unless we see some sort of cap clearing going out by a number of teams this year, which will be hard to do under the new rules, there is going to be a little bit of a tightness in the NBA spending situation for the next year. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked about that a bunch of summer. I've called it the log jam. I mean, we're in the log jam right now, as opposed to the spike, because you have the combination of these new rules on the books with these first and second aprons that hard caps how much teams can spend or how much teams can do trade wise. And then you don't have a lot of money on the books for a salary cap wise, because the cap was essentially flat for 3 or 4 years and all the contracts were going up by 5 or 8%. And so the league as a whole has to grow through that period of time. And like you said, over the next couple of years, the agents are right. The cap is probably going to go up by 10% a year. Contracts are going to go up by 8 or less a year. Naturally, you're going to get away from all these aprons and all this stuff because the aprons are going to grow with the cap too. And 2 or 3 years from now, there probably will be a ton more flexibility and more cap space and a lot more stuff going on. But right now, you're only talking about a couple of rebuilding teams that are going to have money. And for a guy like Julius, it might make sense to re-sign in Minnesota. Or like you said, maybe Minnesota moves him for something else. But the thing that the Wolves have now that they didn't before are options. And they have series of things they could potentially do. Whereas before it was basically they got to try to find a way to move Karl for something or one of their other high-priced players for something because they only had so many ways they could potentially go to save money because one way or the other, they were going to have to save money at some point. And while I understand people saying they might have gotten worse, they don't like the fit as much with Randle because of his shooting component as opposed to Karl. I think this is as good a trade as they could have made. I think it might make them better in the aggregate. And they have the ability now with the Detroit pick, with the roster flexibility they have to make more moves to improve the team as the year goes on. So I agree. I think they did as well as they could. And I think it's like Bobby said at the beginning, you get offered this trade, they weren't going to get a better trade for Karl Towns than this. And so I think you have to take it and see where the chips fall from there and then adjust as you go.
I saw Kevin Pelton gave the Wolves a B+ and the Knicks a B. So I guess he's leaning towards the Wolves too. You got Bobby. These are two guys who are former front office guys. Bobby with a lot of experience. Bobby's leaning towards Minnesota. It sounds like you're leaning towards Minnesota.
You know, it's funny. It's funny. Yeah, I am leaning towards Minnesota. But if you talk to people, and I was texting with somebody close to that organization this morning, and I was basically reiterated the same point. Hey, listen, I really like your roster flexibility. And he's like, well, man, he's like, tell that to our local media. So I get it. Listen, it's
hard to give up the best player in the trade in a vacuum and feel like you came away winning when you're in a situation Minnesota's been, particularly again, coming off winning a playoff series for the second time in franchise history.
Yeah, that's the big thing.
It's a difficult spot on a lot of levels.
Yeah, getting to a conference finals and you moved, one of your best players 2 days before training camp, and you're having an ownership dispute going on. I get it. I understand all that comes with it.
So I did a piece on Karl Towns last season, spent some time with him, and he told me this story. I think I can tell it now. Going into last year, 2 years ago, after the Rudy Gobert trade, I guess it would be going into last summer of 2023. I keep screwing that up. He had asked to meet with Tim Connolly after the season because he wanted to know. The Gobert trade came out of nowhere. It stunned the entire organization. And he was like, I don't want to be stunned that I'm getting traded. So he asked to meet with Tim Connolly. And it took a few weeks to get it organized. And finally, Tim came out to his house and they had dinner and they sat around. And Karl was just like, hey, are you going to trade me? And Tim said a bunch of things. We don't want to trade you. We think you're a great fit here. We're building this team around you and Ant and all these things. But at the end of the conversation, Tim couldn't say to him, I'm not going to trade you, which is probably, he shouldn't say it. I think he's just being honest. He's being responsible. He's a smart executive. He didn't say it. And so while Karl was 100% bought in, and I really believe that being around the Wolves last year, having conversations with everybody up and down their organization, I do believe that Karl was 100% bought in. And I do believe he was truly invested in Ant Edwards' success. Maybe even too invested at times, because in the playoffs, Ant kind of had to push Karl to say, hey, you need to be more assertive and look for it and do your thing. Because as we know, Karl has a high variance of how he plays in playoff games. He's had some really suspect ones where he's been absent. He's had some great ones. And I think the Knicks fans might have an interesting relationship with him when it comes to that going forward. But ever since that, which is now well over a year and a half, even though Karl really wanted to be a Timberwolf and wanted to do this going forward and had no interest in going anywhere, even back home, he obviously knew that the Knicks were attacked, were interested in him. He knew that. He was very well aware. I genuinely believe he wanted to be there, but he always knew that there was a chance he was going to be traded. And talking to him in the locker room after game 5, he knew there was a chance it was his last game. He didn't want it to be. He was getting ready to start the season. He thought it wasn't going to happen. As you guys say, even though you knew they were talking on Wednesday and Thursday, you didn't think it was a full chance. Of course, he heard the rumors, but he didn't think it was really going to happen. And so it really was something that was always possible that just fell into place at this time. And so while it was a blockbuster trade, it certainly was not something that was completely unforeseen. And now we will see how they come out of it. And it's obviously going to be a big talking point going forward.
I mean, it really sets Karl Towns up to be one of the truly defining players of the season. I mean, this is a gigantic bet on him. And, you know, Bobby spent a long time living in this part of the world. And the Knicks, there's more excitement around the Knicks franchise than there's been in a quarter century since they last made the finals. Like, this is a city that's ready for this team to win. Like, and the moves they made this summer, like, the grace period is over for the Knicks. Like, this, they have made moves that would indicate they believe they can win today. And yes, I agree with you on the window, and they think they've got a window here, but you make these moves and you pay OG Anunoby and you trade all the stuff for Mikal Bridges and you make this deal now because you think you're good enough to win today. And that all really hinges, for as much as this is Jalen Brunson's team, on Karl Towns becoming a different player than he's been in the past. And it's a huge opportunity for him, and it's a huge bet on him. And it's going to be one of the things to watch in the whole league this year to see how it goes.
Okay, I agree. Before we go, I want to take a moment here to acknowledge our friend and colleague, Zach Lowe, who left us at ESPN over the last couple of years. Zach has been a tremendous colleague to all of us for a decade. We're huge fans of Zach's. He is one of the leading voices in the NBA podcast world, has been for a long time and probably will be going into the future. He was a tremendous teammate here on ESPN podcasts. You know that Zach and I did podcasts together at the conclusion of the finals games over the last few years. We spent a lot of time together across the country, spent a lot of time working on stuff together. A couple of the biggest stories I did at ESPN were with Zach. We are very sorry and sad to see him go. I wish him the best, but he doesn't need my wishes. He's gonna be great. And so I will say thank you, Zach. Best of luck in the future. And we will be a fan of you no matter what you do next. And look forward to that.
I mean, I'll say the same thing I said to Zach on whatever day it was, Thursday, when I talked to him. When I interviewed at the Washington Post 9 years ago like 9 years ago now, basically, for their job to cover the whole league as a national NBA writer, my pitch was very simple. I can't do the video work that Zach does in the middle of his columns, but I will take the top part and the bottom part, and I'll put them together, and I will try to do that every day, because he always has insightful and interesting thoughts on what's going on around the league at a deep level, and has been the gold standard in that space for a very long time. And on top of that, has been a good friend for a very long time. And I look forward to the next time I'm on his pod, whenever that is.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I whenever Zach asked me to come on my pod, I knew I needed to carve out like 2 hours. Like, hey, can you come on at 10? And I'm like, yeah, I better make sure I have nothing from 10 to like 12:30, because I knew those pods could go like an hour and a half, just because I think he loved covering, I mean, he's still here. He loves covering basketball. He loves, whether it be the X's and O's or whether the roster building or the trades, like and I always tease with him, like, like it would be like 11:30 at night, and he'd like send me a text, "Hey, is Colin Sexton extension eligible?" And I'd say to him, "Yeah, but can you just read my spreadsheets? Like, can you just go in there and you could find that he is?" And I didn't, of course, I didn't mind and everything. But listen, I talked to him on Thursday when this all happened, and I'll call him in the next couple days here. But it stings, but he will land on his feet. He will land on his feet, whatever the next opportunity for him is going to be, because I know there will be another opportunity for him.
Thank you, Zach. We'll see you soon. And thank you for watching, listening to the Hoop Collective podcast. We got a big media day. Our big media day pod. We'll have everybody on from all over the country at all the media days. I'm headed to Oklahoma City. Bontemps is headed to Philly and then the Bahamas, and we'll have people from everywhere. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.